That symbol, she whispered, staring at the human's chest. You're him. The air of Cygnus X1 tasted of rust and regret. It was a thin atmosphere, barely fit for Felina's Cathar physiology, and it carried the fine metallic dust of pulverized cities on every whisper of wind. 2 centuries of silence had turned a monument to human ambition into a planetary tombstone. The official histories, the ones taught by her superiors at the Institute, called the colony's demise a lesson in overreach. Felina, tracing the faint energy signatures still bleeding from the planet's core, called it a lie. Her ship, a sleek Cathar scout vessel, was a silver dart of life against the ochre desolation of the starport. Beyond its viewport, crumbling gantries clawed at a sky the color of a fading bruise. Her mission was simple: uncover the truth. Her academic mentor, a cautious male named Ilaro, had called it a fool's errand, a search for nuance in a binary event. The Vorlag swarm came, the colony fell. End of story. But the data fragments she'd recovered from a derelict freighter hinted at something more: a ghost in the machine of history. That ghost had a name, Damocles. She needed a guide. The starport's cantina was a hollowed-out cargo container populated by scavengers and ghosts of a different sort. A boisterous salvager, his face a roadmap of poor decisions, tried to offer his services, his voice booming in the enclosed space. Felina's ears flattened against her fiery red hair in annoyance, and she bypassed him without a word, her tail giving a single dismissive flick. The port administrator, a weary woman hunched over a flickering console, pointed her toward a dim corner. "If you want the ruins, you want him," she said, not looking up. "No one knows the dead zones better." He sat alone, a mountain of a man folded into a space too small for him. His short brown hair was neat, but his clothes, durable patched composites, were frayed with use. He nursed a cup of steaming liquid, his hands broad and calloused around the mug. As she approached, he looked up, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held an ancient weariness that seemed at odds with the powerful set of his jaw and the sheer breadth of his shoulders. He was exactly as the administrator had described him, formidable, quiet, and radiating an aura of profound solitude. "I need a guide," Felina began, her voice crisp and professional. "I am a xenohistorian studying the fall of the colony. The fee is negotiable." He took a slow sip from his cup, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her sleek gear, her sharp, intelligent features, the alert posture of a predator. "I'm not for hire." His voice was a low baritone, laced with a gravely disuse. "My research indicates that certain sealed zones may contain untainted artifacts. Concordance law promises a generous finder's percentage." He almost smiled, a faint, bitter tug at the corner of his mouth. "There's nothing left out there but dust and echoes." Felina held her ground. Her instincts, honed by years of academic rivalry and political maneuvering, told her this was the man she needed. "I have the access codes for the primary historical sites, sealed sectors the Concordance has yet to open. I simply require transport and expertise in navigating the structural decay." His gaze sharpened slightly. "What kind of work?" "Deep resonance scanning. I'm looking for shielded facilities, specifically subterranean installations." He was silent for a long moment, studying her with an unnerving intensity. He seemed to be weighing something far heavier than a salvager's fee. "I don't want credits," he said at last. "You're Cathar. Your deep scan kits use the old Series 7 power cells, the heavy ones." Felina blinked, surprised by the specificity. She did indeed have 2 such cells, antiquated but reliable. "They are rare." "I need one," he stated. It was not a request. "1 cell, and I'll take you wherever your scans lead. My name is Austin." It was an unorthodox fee, a strange request that tickled the edges of her curiosity, but the quiet certainty in his eyes sealed the deal. He was a man who knew precisely what he wanted, and for some reason it was a piece of her past. "Agreed," she said, extending a hand. He looked at her offered hand for a second before giving it a single firm shake. His grip was like Durasteel, warm and solid. "We leave at first light." Austin's surface rover was a testament to function over form. It was a rugged, 6-wheeled machine, scarred and patched, its armor plating bearing the marks of a long, hard life. Inside, the cockpit was cramped and utilitarian, stripped of all but the most essential controls. It smelled of smoke, oil, and the faint, clean scent of electrical insulation. He drove with an economy of motion that bordered on prescience, his hands resting lightly on the controls as he guided the heavy vehicle through the skeletal remains of a city. Towering, shattered structures loomed over them like the ribs of a gargantuan beast. Wind whistled through empty window frames, a mournful, constant song. Felina found her attention divided between her sensor readouts and the man beside her. He spoke little, his focus entirely on the treacherous path ahead, yet his presence filled the small cabin. There was a coiled stillness about him, a sense of immense power held in careful reserve. "The decay is worse than the geological surveys suggested," she commented, noting a fissure that had split a ferrocrete avenue in two. "The ground remembers," Austin replied, his voice a low rumble over the engine's hum. He navigated around the chasm without slowing. The planetary defense grid fired for 3 days straight. It fractured the continental plate. His knowledge was intimate, specific. It wasn't the detached information of a historian, it was the earned wisdom of someone who had walked these ruins for a lifetime. Felina cross-referenced his statement on her datapad. The detail was buried deep in a geological addendum, not common knowledge. "You've studied this extensively," she probed. He just grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the path. Their first real test came as they navigated a collapsed overpass. A section of the ramp, weakened by 200 years of stress, groaned under the rover's weight. With a screech of tortured metal, the Duracrete buckled. Felina braced for the lurch, but Austin was already reacting. He didn't swerve or brake. He accelerated, a surge of power that pushed them across the failing section just as it crumbled into the chasm below. Felina's heart hammered against her ribs. "Your reaction time is notable." "You learn to listen to the ruins," he said, his knuckles white on the controls. "They tell you when they're tired of standing." Later, while they were on foot exploring the entrance to a transit hub, he demonstrated that same unnerving foresight. He stopped abruptly, putting a firm hand on her shoulder to halt her. The touch was heavy, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. "Wait," he commanded. She followed his gaze to the archway ahead. For a moment, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, with a faint metallic sigh, a multi-ton slab of the ceiling sheared away and crashed to the ground exactly where she would have been standing. Dust billowed out, thick and choking. Austin hadn't even flinched. He simply waited for the dust to settle before releasing her and continuing on, his silence more eloquent than any explanation. The physical contact, brief as it was, lingered. His hand had been steady and strong, a point of absolute stability in a world defined by its decay. Her professional curiosity was now irrevocably tangled with a more personal, more dangerous intrigue. She found herself watching the play of muscles across his broad back as he moved, the way his head tilted as he listened to the silence. She tried to bring the conversation back to her work, to the people who had lived and died here. "What do you think they were like?" she asked, gesturing to the ghostly outlines of hab blocks. "The colonists." Austin stopped and looked out at the dead city, a flicker of something raw and painful in his eyes. "They were stubborn," he said softly, "and they ran out of time." They reached the communications outpost at dusk. It was a skeletal tower, its massive dish antenna bent and twisted like a broken flower. According to her research, this relay station had been one of the last to fall silent. It was a prime location for an intact data core. Austin brought the rover to a halt at a safe distance, his eyes methodically scanning the crumbling structure. "The foundation is unstable," he stated, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was immense. "We go in on foot. Stay behind me." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ancient plastics and cold metal. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, preserving the scene of a final, frantic day. Overturned consoles and scattered data slates told a story of chaos. Felina moved with reverence, her historian's mind cataloging every detail. While she began carefully deploying her portable deep scanner, Austin took up a position near the main entryway. He didn't draw a weapon, but his posture shifted. He became a sentinel, his stillness a stark contrast to her meticulous activity. His gaze never wavered from the broken cityscape outside, a silent, patient watchman. Felina worked for over an hour, her sensitive ears picking up the faint hum of her equipment. Finally, she found it, a shielded data port, its integrity light still blinking a hopeful green after 2 centuries of neglect. She carefully interfaced her datapad. Corruption was rampant. Most of the files were fragmented into digital noise, but then a keyword search pinged. Damocles. A partially recovered log entry flickered onto her screen. It was from the station's chief engineer. Grid is failing. The governor's evacuation order is madness. The Vorlog are adapting. We need more time. Commander says the Damocles countermeasure is our only hope. He's powering it up from the central bunker. May the spirits of our ancestors forgive what he is about to do. Felina's breath hitched. This was it. Proof. The official history claimed the planetary grid had simply overloaded. There was no mention of a countermeasure or a commander taking independent action. It suggested a deliberate tactical decision, not a catastrophic failure. Her fur bristled with excitement. She turned to Austin, her eyes bright. I found something. The logs mention a Damocles countermeasure. It seems the colony fought back in a way the concordance never recorded. Have you ever heard of it? Austin's gaze shifted from the doorway to her, and his expression was carefully blank. Salvager's myth, he said, his voice flat. Stories they tell around the campfires, a ghost who supposedly turned the planet's guns on the bugs. This isn't a myth, Felina insisted, holding up her datapad. This is a direct log entry from the station engineer. Damocles was real. He looked at the glowing text, then back at her. The muscle in his jaw tightened, a small, almost imperceptible tick. Doesn't matter what it was called, he said, turning his attention back to the desolate view. The end result was the same. His dismissal was too quick, too final. The lie was in his averted eyes, in the rigid set of his shoulders. He knew more than he was letting on. He wasn't just a guide, he was a gatekeeper, and Felina was beginning to feel she was studying not one mystery but 2. The fall of a colony and the deep, guarded sorrow of the man named Austin. She returned to her work, her mind racing. The ghost story had a name, and her guide was afraid of it. The wind began as a low moan, rising to a piercing shriek that scoured the ruins with corrosive dust. The sky, already bleak, darkened to a swirling vortex of angry brown. Austin had seen the signs a half hour before, his head tilting to the wind like an animal sensing a predator. Storm's coming, he had announced, his voice tight. A bad one. We need shelter, now. He drove the rover with controlled urgency, pushing the machine into the maw of a partially collapsed subterranean transit conduit just as the first wave of the storm hit. The sound was deafening, a million tiny needles scraping against the rover's hull. Austin killed the lights, plunging them into near-total darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint emergency strips along the conduit's ceiling. The enclosed space, which had felt functional before, now seemed suffocatingly intimate. The roar of the storm outside created a bubble of forced silence within. Felina could hear the soft scuff of Austin's boots on the metal floor, the faint rasp of his breathing. He moved with quiet competence, checking the seals on the rover's hatch before pulling a compact thermal unit from a storage locker. The temperature will drop fast, he said, his voice low in the dark. This will keep the cabin from flash freezing. As he worked, Felina noticed a dark stain spreading on her sleeve. A sharp edge of a console had sliced her arm during their hasty entry. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily. Before she could tend to it herself, Austin noticed. He stopped what he was doing and turned to her. You're hurt. It's a scratch, she said dismissively. He ignored her, retrieving a med kit. Let me see. His tone brooked no argument. He knelt before her, and the small space seemed to shrink further. He took her arm, his touch shockingly gentle for a man of his size. His large, calloused fingers carefully cleaned the wound, his movements precise and economical. The heat from his hands seeped into her skin, a startling contrast to the growing cold. Felina found herself holding her breath, acutely aware of his proximity. She could see the concentration etched on his face in the dim light, the way his brow furrowed slightly. The air thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. To break the spell, she fumbled for her datapad, angling the screen away from him. I managed to decrypt another fragment before the storm hit, she said, her voice a little too high. It's a personal log, from one of the project scientists. She read the text aloud, her own voice sounding foreign in the roaring silence. He has accepted the protocol. I don't know how he can bear it. The psychological toll of long-term cryostasis. Alone, in the dark. It's a vigil, a sentence. He will be an echo, a ghost left to watch over a graveyard. I pray he never has to wake up. She looked up from the pad, her mind racing. Cryostasis. It makes sense. If this Damocles was meant to be a last resort, a failsafe, they would need to preserve him. But to do it long-term, the technology was unstable then. Austin finished dressing her wound, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second too long before he pulled away. He sat back on his heels, his face cast in shadow. Maybe he wasn't meant to be the end of the story, he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Maybe he was just the beginning of a longer one. The storm raged on, trapping them in their metal shell. But the real storm was the one brewing between them, a tempest of secrets, sorrow, and a strange, burgeoning connection in the heart of the ruins. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the air washed clean and the ruins glistening under the weak sun. The silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the drip of water from stressed metal. Austin had them moving quickly, his earlier reticence replaced by a grim sense of purpose. Felina's scans now pointed definitively toward a single location, a vast, sunken plaza in what had been the colony's administrative heart. The energy signature of the command bunker was a faint but steady pulse beneath it. They left the rover at the plaza's edge, the ground too unstable for the vehicle's weight. The scale of the destruction here was absolute. The plaza was a cratered wasteland of shattered ferrocrete and twisted girders, testament to the unimaginable forces unleashed 2 centuries ago. Felina felt a historian's awe and a Cathar's sorrow. It was a place of immense violent death. The main entrance would have been there, Austin said, pointing with his chin toward a mountain of rubble. Collapsed. We'll need to find a service conduit. He moved with a hunter's grace, testing each step before committing his weight. Felina followed close behind, her datapad clutched in her hand, her senses on high alert. The ground beneath her feet felt fragile. They were halfway across the plaza when it happened. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling, a deep, nauseating lurch from the planet's core. It was a seismic tremor, a lingering aftershock from the battle that had fractured the world's crust. For a terrifying second, the world seemed to ripple. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric on a planetary scale, the ground directly ahead of them split apart. A fisher, black and hungry, raced across the plaza. Austin reacted instantly. "Felina!" he roared, lunging for her. His hand clamped around her arm, pulling her back from the crumbling edge. But the ground they were on was no longer stable. It tilted violently, a massive slab of ferrocrete breaking loose. They lost their footing, a disorienting moment of weightlessness followed by the sickening slide into darkness. The world became a chaotic blur of falling debris, scraping metal, and the roar of collapsing earth. Austin shielded her with his body, his solid form an anchor in the maelstrom. Their descent was a brutal, scraping slide down a steep tunnel of rubble and earth that had opened beneath them. It ended with a jarring impact that knocked the air from Felina's lungs and sent her datapad skittering away into the gloom. She was dazed, her head ringing. For a moment, all was blackness and the taste of dust. Then a single beam of light from Austin's shoulder lamp cut through the darkness. He was already on his feet, his initial shock giving way to a grim, resonant familiarity. Behind them, the tunnel they had fallen through groaned one last time and collapsed completely, sealing them in with a sound of final, thunderous finality. They were trapped. Felina scrambled upright, her heart's pounding a frantic rhythm. Her gaze followed the beam of Austin's light. They were in a massive man-made space. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow. The air was cold, stale, and utterly still. She saw the outlines of command consoles, view screens, and walkways, all draped in the velvet shroud of 2 centuries of dust. They had found the Damocles command bunker. They had fallen directly into the heart of the mystery. And as the last pebbles skittered to a halt, plunging them into an absolute tomb-like silence, Felina realized the truth of their situation. They were home. A low hum answered Austin's touch, and rows of emergency lights flickered to life along the walls. The soft red glow illuminated a cavernous space, a ghost of a room preserved in time. The Damocles Command Center was vast, circular, with a holographic display table at its center and workstations ringing the perimeter. Every surface wore a thick blanket of gray dust, softening every edge, muffling every potential echo. It was a historian's dream. It was a death trap. The air was thin, the scent of smoke and recycled air so faint it was almost non-existent. A metallic taste coated Felina's tongue. "Life support," she rasped, her training kicking in. "It must be on minimal backup. It won't sustain us for long." She was paralyzed for a moment, caught between the academic thrill of her discovery and the primal fear of suffocation. She looked at Austin, expecting to see that same fear mirrored in his eyes. Instead, she saw a focused intensity she had not seen before. He wasn't looking at the command consoles or the holographic table, the obvious points of interest. His gaze was fixed on a far wall, at a featureless panel that was indistinguishable from the rest. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. He moved with a strange, unnerving purpose. It wasn't the cautious exploration of a salvager in a new environment. It was the confident stride of a man walking through his own home. He didn't need his shoulder lamp. He navigated the obstacles. A fallen stanchion, a cluster of overturned chairs, as if by muscle memory, his boots leaving the first fresh tracks in the dust of 200 years. Felina watched, her breath held tight in her chest. A cold knot of bewilderment and suspicion forming in her gut. How could he know the layout? How could he move with such certainty in a place sealed from the world for generations? He reached the unmarked panel and ran his gloved hand over its surface, wiping away the dust. Beneath, there was no handle, no keypad. He simply pressed a specific spot on the lower corner. With a hiss of ancient pneumatics, the panel slid aside, revealing a recess filled with heavy, archaic-looking levers and circuit breakers. Austin grunted with satisfaction. He braced himself, grabbing hold of the largest lever, a thick bar of copper stained dark with age. "Primary environmental control," he said, more to himself than to her. "If the core capacitors still hold a charge—" He threw his weight against the lever. It didn't budge. It was frozen solid by time and disuse. Felina's hope withered. Her knowledge of ancient texts and energy signatures was useless here. They would die, surrounded by the answers she had sought, suffocated by the very history she had come to uncover. Austin set his jaw, a grim line of determination. He repositioned his grip, planting his feet wide, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunched under his worn jacket, straining against the fabric. Her suspicion was now a roaring fire. He wasn't a salvager. He wasn't just a guide. He was something else entirely, something tied to this place, this cold, silent tomb. And as he prepared to heave against the lever with all his strength, she had the sudden, chilling premonition that she was about to find out exactly what that was. Austin let out a guttural roar of effort, a primal sound that was swallowed by the immense silence of the bunker. He threw his entire body into the motion, his powerful legs driving, his back and arms straining as one. The lever groaned in protest, a high, screeching complaint of metal on metal. For a moment, nothing happened. The bar remained stubbornly in place, a monument to 2 centuries of inertia. Felina watched, her heart's hammering a frantic, desperate beat. The air was growing thinner, a noticeable pressure building in her ears. He regrouped, taking a deep, ragged breath. He adjusted his grip, his knuckles white. "Come on," he growled through clenched teeth, a prayer to a dead machine. He lunged again, a surge of raw, focused power. The muscles in his back and shoulders, already taut, became plates of living rock beneath his jacket. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't just the screech of the lever. It was the sharp, tearing sound of stressed fabric. The seam across his broad shoulders, already frayed and worn, split open with a violent rip. The lever moved, an inch, then another. With a final, explosive roar that seemed to tear from his very soul, Austin slammed the massive switch down into its housing. It connected with a deep, resonant thunk that echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat. For a second, nothing. Then a low hum began to build, and a new series of lights. A clean white light flickered on overhead. A rush of cool, fresh air washed over Felina, carrying the scent of activated filters and charged ions. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever smelled. The primary life support system was online. Austin leaned heavily against the wall, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his brow. The effort had cost him. His jacket, torn wide open by the strain, hung in tatters from his arms. He shrugged the ruined garment off, letting it fall to the dusty floor. He was wearing a dark, form-fitting undershirt, its synthetic material designed for pressure and impact. And there, in the center of his chest, stark against the black fabric in the clear white light, was a symbol. It was not a brand or a simple logo. It was a scorched, stylized emblem woven into the very fabric of the armor, a downward-pointing sword, its hilt intricate, its blade wrapped in a single, unbroken thread. Felina stared, her mind struggling to connect the impossible dots. She had seen that symbol before, not in person, but in the deepest, most encrypted fragments of her research, in the corner of a schematic, in a footnote on a personnel file, the symbol of the Damocles Project. The myths, the ghost stories, the scientific logs, the man before her, the truth crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air she had just regained. He was not a salvager who knew the stories. He was the source of them, the commander from the engineer's log, the echo from the scientist's prayer, the lonely ghost left to watch over a graveyard. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She took a shaky step forward, her gaze locked on the emblem that seemed to burn with the weight of history. "That symbol," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible in the hum of the newly awakened bunker. Her eyes lifted from his chest to meet his, and in their depths she saw not the weary salvager, but the crushing infinite loneliness of a man out of time. "You're him." The hum of the life support system was the only sound in the world. It was a steady, reassuring drone, a promise of life in a place that had only known death. Austin didn't move. He simply leaned against the console, his breathing slowly returning to normal, making no effort to cover the emblem on his chest. The secret was out, a 200-year-old burden finally laid bare in the sterile white light. He finally met her gaze, and the carefully constructed walls of the quiet salvager crumbled, revealing the man within. His eyes held the profound and terrible weight of his vigil. It was a loneliness so vast, so complete, that Felina felt an empathetic ache deep in her own being. He was an island in the stream of time, and she was the first person to wash ashore in 2 centuries. He gave a slow, tired nod, a single, minute movement, yet it confirmed everything. It was an admission, a confession, and a surrender all at once. The professional dynamic between them didn't just break. It was annihilated, vaporized in the shockwave of the reveal. The historian and her guide, the scholar and her subject, those roles were meaningless now. All that remained were 2 people trapped in a tomb, one of whom had been buried alive for 200 years. Felina took another step closer, her earlier fear replaced by a wave of overwhelming, staggering empathy. Her mind reeled, recontextualizing every moment they had spent together, his intimate knowledge of the ruins, his prescient warnings, his strange fee, the power cell, likely a necessary component for some piece of his ancient equipment, his dismissal of the Damocles myth, his pain-filled eyes when he spoke of the colonists. He hadn't been remembering history. He had been reliving it. "How?" she finally managed to ask, the word a soft puff of air. "Cryostasis," he answered, his voice raw, as if the words themselves were artifacts he had to excavate from deep within. The bunker was designed for a single long-term occupant, a failsafe, in case the Vorlog ever returned. A failsafe, a sentinel, a ghost. The words from her research came back to her, no longer academic curiosities but brutal, personal truths. She thought of the scientist's log entry. "I pray he never has to wake up," but he had woken up. Or perhaps, she realized with a jolt, he had never been truly asleep. "You've been here all this time?" He shook his head, pushing himself away from the console. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his boots silent on the dusty floor. "I was awakened by a seismic monitor 50 years ago. The stasis pod suffered minor damage. The system couldn't guarantee another cycle." He stopped and looked around the vast, empty room. "So I've been waiting. Waiting. For 50 years, alone, in this silent metal cavern beneath a dead world." The sheer scale of that solitude was a physical weight. Felina felt it settle on her own shoulders. The man she had hired, the quiet, rugged salvager she had felt a grudging, then growing attraction to, was an echo from a lost era. He was the last living citizen of a colony of ghosts. "The Concordance, they don't know you're here," she stated, the realization dawning. "No one knows," he confirmed. "The project was black, highly classified. When the colony fell, so did the secret of this place. I am an oversight." An oversight, a forgotten soldier left at his post long after the war was over. Felina's Cathar heritage prized history and lineage above all else. Before her stood the ultimate historical artifact, a living, breathing man who was his own history. And all she felt was a profound, aching sorrow for the man himself. The bunker was no longer just a setting. It was a sanctuary, a confessional. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the steady hum of the life support. Sealed off from the universe, time lost its meaning. All that existed was the cavernous room and the two souls within it. They talked, or rather, Austin talked, and Felina listened. The floodgates of 2 centuries of silence broke open, and the story of Damocles poured out of him, not as a historical account, but as a raw, personal testimony. He spoke of the final days of the colony, the panic, the disbelief as the Vorlog swarm, a thing of myth, blotted out the sun. He described the governor's desperate evacuation plan and the terrible, calculated decision made by a small group of military commanders and scientists. The Vorlog weren't just a force of nature, he said, his voice low and haunted, his gaze fixed on the dust-shrouded holographic table. They learned. Every ship we threw at them, every tactic we used, they adapted to it in minutes. The planetary grid was our last resort, but just firing it wildly would have only worked once. He explained the Damocles countermeasure. It wasn't just about firing the planet's defensive weapons. It was about using them with surgical precision, analyzing the swarm's energy frequencies and turning their own power against them, creating a feedback loop that would tear their fleet apart. It required a single operator with an unbreachable connection to the grid, someone who could make tactical decisions faster than any committee. "We saved 2 evacuation transports," he said, a flicker of ancient pride in his eyes. 40,000 people, they made it out. "And you stayed," Felina whispered. He led her to a small alcove she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a retractable blast door. Inside, it was Spartan, a simple cot, a small workstation, and against the back wall, an upright metal coffin lined with frost. His cryopod. He ran a hand over its frosted surface. "This was my part of the bargain. I would guide the countermeasure, and then I would watch." The stasis system was tied to long-range sensors. If any Vorlag energy signature was detected in this sector again, it would wake me. I was the alarm bell nobody was supposed to hear. Felina reached out, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the pod. This small, cold box had been his entire world. The solitary horror of it was almost incomprehensible. The shared vulnerability in the enclosed space was a tangible thing, a magnetic field drawing them together. He had been strong for 200 years. Now, in her presence, he finally allowed himself to be weary. "It must have been," she started, but words failed her. What could she say? He turned from the pod to face her, the space between them shrinking to nothing. "The worst part," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "wasn't the waiting. It was the silence. Knowing everything and everyone you ever knew was gone, that the galaxy went on without you. I used to dream of voices, any voice." His gaze was intense, searching. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, not as a Cathar or a historian, but as the first person to share his silence. The first voice in his tomb. An unspoken need, raw and overwhelming, passed between them. The need for connection, for touch, for the simple affirmation that he was no longer alone. She lifted her hand, her movements slow, and gently touched the symbol on his chest. The fabric was cool, but beneath it, she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart, a heart that had kept beating, alone in the dark, for centuries. His hand came up and covered hers, his fingers lacing through her own. His skin was warm, real. In that simple touch, 200 years of solitude began to dissolve. Rescue was a distant, abstract concept. Days or weeks could pass before her absence was noted, her ship's location tracked, a team dispatched. The bunker was their world now, and it transformed from a prison into a sanctuary. The tomb became a home. Their dynamic shifted entirely. The roles of historian and subject, guide and client, evaporated, leaving only a man and a woman. Felina, using her knowledge of archaic systems, helped Austin access the bunker's full archival memory. The logs were a treasure trove, a complete, unfiltered history of the colony. But for Austin, they were a collection of ghosts. He saw the faces of his friends on security footage, heard their voices in audio logs. Felina was there beside him, a steadying presence, her hand resting on his arm, sharing the weight of his memories. In turn, he became her guide to the past, filling in the gaps in her knowledge with the vibrant, lived-in details of a world he had loved. He described the festivals in the plaza above, the taste of the food grown in the hydroponic bays, the sound of children's laughter in the transit hubs. He brought the dead city to life for her. The intellectual and emotional connection that had been forged in revelation and confession deepened into something more profound. The charged tension that had sparked between them in the storm-swept rover now found its release in the quiet intimacy of their shared sanctuary. One cycle, after viewing a particularly painful log of the final roll call before the evacuation, Austin fell silent, the weight of his losses settling heavily upon him. He stood before the main view screen, which they had configured to show a star chart of the galaxy as it was now, a galaxy that had forgotten him. Felina came to stand beside him. She didn't speak. She simply leaned her head against his powerful shoulder, her distinctive Cathar ears brushing against his neck. Her tail wrapped gently around his waist, a gesture of comfort and possession. He turned his head, his cheek resting against the top of her fiery hair. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he murmured, his voice thick, the warmth of another person. She looked up at him, her sharp features softened in the dim light of the star chart. "You are not an echo, Austin. You are not a ghost." She raised a hand to his face, her thumb stroking his rough jawline. "You're a survivor, and you are not alone anymore." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was a slow, deep exploration, filled with centuries of loneliness and the profound, staggering relief of finding solace. It was a kiss that tasted of loss and hope, of shared history and a brand new, unwritten future. His arms, which had once strained to save a dying world, now wrapped around her, pulling her close, holding her as if she were the only real thing in the universe. In the heart of a dead planet, in a tomb designed for a solitary vigil, the last man of Cygnus X1 was no longer a sentinel watching over a graveyard. He was just a man, holding his future in his arms. The vigil was no longer his alone to keep. It was theirs to share.